Picture this, a grand medieval palace glowing with golden lamps and perfumed smoke, the air heavy with incense, silk curtains drifting with each hidden breath. Music plays faintly, but it is not the music of freedom. Behind the walls, behind the locked doors, stories unfolded that no chronicler dared to write honestly, because in the shadows of these empires lived the silenced, slaves. They were not always broken men in chains or faceless laborers in fields. Some were treasures paraded in jewels, others secrets hidden in bedchambers. They were the ornaments of kings, the living playthings of empires. Their lives were at once luxurious and unbearable, beautiful and tragic, seductive and cruel. When we read history, we are told of great battles, mighty rulers, holy wars, treaties, crowns, dynasties. But what about the whispers behind the curtains? What about the moments when silk veils slid across trembling skin, when eyes lowered in obedience but secretly screamed in silence? What about the slaves who became confidants, companions, and sometimes forbidden lovers? The truth is that slavery in medieval empires was not just an economic system. It was a theater of power, desire, and control. To own a slave was not merely to own labor, it was to own temptation itself. The rulers knew this, they indulged in it, and they buried the evidence of it deep within their palaces.
Tonight, we will dig into those shadows. We will not repeat the safe versions written in school books. We will uncover the dark secrets, the unspoken stories of how medieval empires treated their slaves, not as humans, but as living reflections of their masters' power, lust, and cruelty. Close your eyes and imagine a medieval court. The king or sultan sits high on his throne, his robes glittering with gems. Around him are guards, ministers, advisors. But then your eyes wander further. You see slaves standing still, silent, dressed not in rags, but in garments of gold and silk. Their beauty is unsettling. Their silence is heavy. Their presence is both alluring and tragic. Every glance at them is a reminder that power can clothe someone in riches, yet strip them of freedom. Every smile they are forced to give is a mask over chains, and every touch of perfume that clings to their skin is a disguise for captivity. The medieval empires mastered this paradox. They turned slavery into a spectacle. They made the powerless appear enchanting, and the enslaved into instruments of desire. What you are about to hear is not a fairy tale. It is history, but told the way it truly was, seductive, disturbing, and unforgettable.
In the medieval world, slaves were more than workers. They were living ornaments. When rulers wished to flaunt their wealth, they did not simply build palaces. They filled them with human symbols of power. Imagine walking into the court of a great caliph or a Christian king. Jewels sparkle on the floor. Golden lamps light the hall. But what truly captures the eye is the row of slaves, dressed in fabrics that most free men could never dream of touching. Their beauty was chosen carefully, their movements rehearsed, their very existence sculpted to enhance the majesty of the throne. These slaves were expected to be flawless, skin perfumed, eyes painted with kohl, hair oiled and combed, smiles forced even in exhaustion. They were living jewels, shown to ambassadors, paraded before guests, exhibited like treasures. When an empire wanted to show its glory, it showed its slaves. And yet, behind the glittering silk lay chains. The very perfection demanded of them was not for their sake, but for their master's pride. A ruler did not want his guests to see ordinary servants. He wanted them to see angels trapped in golden cages.
Some chronicles describe banquets where slaves poured wine in goblets of silver, their wrists jingling with ornaments, their steps carefully trained to look graceful. To the outsider, it looked like elegance,
But to the slave, each movement was obedience carved into the body. Even the smile they wore was not theirs. It belonged to their master. Slaves were also used as gifts. A victorious general might present a captured girl, chosen for her beauty, as a token of loyalty to his king. Imagine the humiliation, to be handed over like a jewel in a box, admired not as a person, but as a possession. There were stories of kings who had hundreds of slaves in their courts, each selected for some unique feature: skin like ivory, hair like night, eyes that shone like jewels. These were not free relationships, they were displays. The ruler's power grew larger in the presence of slaves, because it reminded everyone, even beauty itself could be owned. And yet, in this display, danger always lurked. For slaves, dressed as ornaments, were still human. They carried secrets. They watched everything. Sometimes their smiles hid rebellion. Sometimes their silence hid sorrow. And sometimes, despite chains, their beauty entangled rulers in ways that reshaped dynasties. To be an ornament in an empire was not simply to stand in silk. It was to become a living mirror, reflecting both the glory and the corruption of those who owned you.
The banquet hall always dazzled with light, but the true stories began when the torches were extinguished, when the music softened into silence, and when the echo of laughter vanished into the corridors. Behind the throne rooms and courtyards lay chambers the world rarely saw. Heavy wooden doors guarded by silence, curtains drawn thick, incense clouding the air. And inside, the hidden world where slaves were not ornaments for the public, but instruments for private desires. History often speaks in polite terms. Chronicles describe servants of the inner quarters or companions of the harem, but those words are veils. Behind them was a reality soaked in perfume and shadows, where the line between power and pleasure blurred into something both intoxicating and cruel. Imagine a young slave girl taken from a distant land. She had no say in her fate. By day, she stood still in silks, pouring wine, walking gracefully as if born for it. But when night fell, she was summoned. A gesture from a king, a whisper from a queen, a command from a noble, and her world shifted from public display to private ritual. She was expected to charm, to smile without trembling, to move like music itself. But beneath her practiced grace was fear, because every mistake could mean punishment. A spilled cup, a broken note in a song, a look that lingered too long, each could invite wrath. And yet, the chambers were not filled with cruelty alone. They were filled with temptation. For rulers, the allure of slaves was not just their beauty, but their silence. A free woman could speak her mind, a noble could demand her rights, but a slave? A slave was expected to obey, to whisper only what pleased the master, to embody desire without resistance. Some rulers filled their hidden chambers with dozens, even hundreds of such companions, each one chosen carefully, eyes that sparkled like emeralds, hair that shone like midnight silk, voices soft as lullabies. They were made to embody fantasies, sculpted into living dreams. But here lies the darker truth. Those fantasies were cages. The women who were told to dance and perfume in gold had once been daughters, sisters, wives in faraway lands. Their beauty, which once their own, had become the property of an empire. Their smiles, which once genuine, had become rehearsed performances for survival. And yet, temptation worked both ways. History whispers of kings who lost themselves to their slaves, rulers who became entangled in forbidden passions that shifted politics, broke alliances, and even destroyed dynasties.
Behind locked doors, power could turn into vulnerability. A ruler might whisper secrets to a slave, reveal weaknesses, even fall in love. And for the slave,
Love was a dangerous gamble, a risk that could bring both luxury and ruin. There are chronicles of empires where slaves rose from the shadows of chambers to the light of power. Some became queens, mothers of heirs, advisors in politics. But their journey always began the same way, behind doors closed to the public, in a world scented with perfume and fear. For the ordinary people outside, the palace looked like glory, but within those locked doors, silk covered chains, and desire covered suffering. These were not fairy tales of romance. They were stories of survival, painted with both seduction and sorrow. Because in those hidden chambers, every touch was a command, every whisper was an order, and every gaze, no matter how tender, was marked by the shadow of ownership. In the palaces of medieval empires, pleasure and punishment were never far apart. The same hands that draped a slave in silk one evening could drag that same slave to chains the next morning. The same lips that whispered praise in candlelight could order lashes at sunrise. It was this dangerous edge, the constant shift between luxury and cruelty, that defined the lives of slaves. For some, the night began with indulgence. The slave would be summoned, bathed in perfumed water, dressed in garments finer than anything she had ever touched before captivity. Her hair would be brushed until it shone, jewels would be fastened to her wrists, and she would be told to enter the chamber like a vision of temptation. The ruler would gaze upon her as though she were a gift from the gods, a living ornament to soothe his eyes, to stir his desires. He might demand she sing, or dance, or simply sit silently while he admired her. To the outside world, it might look like luxury, but to her, it was a performance she could never leave. Every movement rehearsed, every smile forced, every gesture carrying the weight of survival. Yet this fragile illusion could shatter in an instant. One misplaced word, one glance that lingered too long on another, one moment of hesitation. Suddenly, the same ruler who had adorned her with gold could strip her of everything. Chains would replace silk. Whips would replace caresses. The slave's body was not her own. It was a canvas upon which both pleasure and pain were painted at the whim of power. History's chronicles often soften these realities with polite words. They speak of discipline or correction. But the truth is sharper, darker. The punishments were not only physical, they were psychological. To make a slave feel both desired and despised at once was the cruelest mastery of all. There were rulers who believed this dance of indulgence and torment was necessary, that without fear, beauty lost its edge. They wanted slaves who were both graceful and terrified, both alluring and obedient. Fear, they believed, polished desire until it shone like a jewel.
Some stories whisper of slaves who, after nights of music and wine, were sent to cold stone cells before dawn, the memory of luxury still clinging to their skin, but the reality of chains cutting into their wrists. The contrast itself was part of the spectacle, proof that their existence belonged entirely to their master's whim. And yet this cruelty bred something else, fascination. The same people who suffered became the very obsessions of rulers. A slave punished one day could be summoned to the next, dressed again in silk, forced once more into the theater of desire. To the rulers, it was control. To the slaves, it was survival. To history, it was the forbidden truth that pleasure and punishment were not opposites in medieval courts, but partners, intertwined like silk and iron. And it was this twisted dance that turned slavery into more than labor. It turned it into spectacle, into performance, into a dangerous seduction that could both elevate and destroy. Because in those palaces, no embrace was safe, no night was certain, and no beauty could protect a slave from the next morning's cruelty.
Power has a flavor. It is not sweet like honey or bitter like medicine. It is something else, warmer than wine, colder than steel. It slides across the tongue like a secret and lingers like perfume in a closed room. The rulers of medieval empires knew that flavor well, and slavery, more than palaces, more than crowns, let them taste it whenever they wished. To possess another person was the most intimate proof of power. A land can rebel, a general can defect, a noble can scheme, but a body commanded to move, a voice ordered to sing, a smile demanded on cue, these were proofs that power had crossed the skin and entered the spirit. In courts from east to west, enslaved adults became the mirrors in which the mighty admired their own control. The rituals of this control were choreographed with exquisite care. A name might be taken and a new one given, syllables chosen to please a master's ear. Schedules were not simple timetables, but patterns of obedience. Who waited where, who entered when, who was allowed to look up, and who must always lower their gaze. Even silence was scripted. The absence of a word could be as loud as a decree. Consider the gaze. It was never innocent in a palace. To look was to measure rank. To be looked at was to be weighed like treasure. The enslaved were trained to hold the eyes of the ruler just long enough to be captivating, and then bow away before interest turned dangerous. It was a dance without music, the choreography of risk. A heartbeat too bold became insolence. A heartbeat too timid became displeasure. Between those two heartbeats lived survival. Perfume floated through these scenes like a second language. Sandalwood for serenity, rose for romance, amber for wealth. Scents chosen by those who would be seen and by those who demanded to be obeyed. Draperies softened the edges of rooms. Candles softened the edges of faces. It was tenderness that did not require tenderness, intimacy that did not require permission. The theater of desire was built with props of luxury, but its script was written in command.
And yet, power creates its own gravity. The ruler who staged these scenes often stepped into them as a participant and discovered he could not easily leave. Control can be intoxicating, more addictive than any wine, more blinding than any jewel. The more a master rehearsed the spectacle of obedience, the more he needed it to feel whole. He did not simply want company, he wanted the reassurance that his word could become another's heartbeat. That is why courtiers feared the quiet ones, the enslaved adults who learned to read moods better than ministers read reports, who could see storms gathering behind a ruler's smile and calm them with a word, a glance, a practiced laugh. These were not lovers in the ordinary sense, not companions by choice. They were experts in the weather of power. They could make a tyrant sleep like a child and wake like a conqueror. And that talent, born from terror, sharpened by necessity, could change policy more swiftly than any council meeting. Jealousy flourished where power and desire met. Queens and consorts mastered their own strategies, banishments phrased as promotions, gifts that led to distant postings, alliances with eunuchs and chamberlains whose footsteps decided who reached which door. The enslaved stood in the eye of these storms, adorned like victories and handled like weapons. Some were moved across palaces like game pieces, others rooted themselves so deeply in a ruler's habits that removing them shook the walls. The allure of power was not only in what the ruler took, it was in what he believed he was giving. To elevate an enslaved singer into silks, to teach an enslaved scribe to hold a pen, to feed an enslaved attendant from the ruler's own table, these gestures felt to the giver like benevolence, even when they were only refinements of ownership. Gratitude was expected, adoration was assumed, and when adoration arrived, rehearsed, necessary, carefully performed, it was taken as proof that the system was merciful.
This was the most seductive illusion of all, the illusion of consent. If the smile looks real, if the laughter rings clear, if the hand reaches willingly, then perhaps this is not cruelty, perhaps this is harmony. But the stage is not the street, and the curtain does not confess. The performance of consent is not consent. It is craft. It is survival. It is the art of staying alive in a room where the wrong word can end a life. There were rulers who fell in love with that performance, mistaking it for truth. They confided state secrets to the same mouths they ordered to sing. They rested state worries on the same shoulders they dressed in gold. Some enslaved people arose on those currents, gaining rooms of their own, keys of their own, influence that made nobles grind their teeth at night. Yet the ladder climbed was built entirely inside the house of the master. Every rung belonged to someone else. The forbidden allure of power reshaped the palaces themselves. Passageways multiplied to separate the seen from the unseen. Screens were carved to let eyes pass while bodies stayed hidden. Bells were strung to summon what words should not. Lists were drawn with names that never touched official paper. Who could enter at dusk? Who must leave at dawn? Who must be moved before a royal visit? Who must not be mentioned to a foreign envoy? The map of desire overlaid the map of government until the two were indistinguishable. And still the fragrance of control thickened. A ruler might test it the way a falconer tests a bird, calling once, twice, 3 times, watching whether the trained flight returns to the wrist. Rewards became their own leash. Punishments became their own pledge. The enslaved learned to anticipate the gesture before it came, to be present in the doorway before the bell, to become the wish the master had not yet formed. To be perfectly timely is to be perfectly owned. Yet power that leans so heavily must eventually stumble. The more a ruler relied on the theater behind closed doors, the more vulnerable he became to those who controlled its curtains, the gatekeepers, the whisperers, the ones who knew which night ended in laughter and which in rage. An empire's fate could pivot on a conversation spoken so softly it never reached the marble floor. And an enslaved attendant who had mastered the art of listening could become, without title or crown, the most dangerous person in the palace. The allure of power promised safety to those who held it, and comfort to those who needed it. In truth, it delivered neither. It delivered hunger. Hunger for obedience. Hunger for reassurance. Hunger for the lovely lie that if everyone smiles, no one is suffering. The lie dazzled because the costumes dazzled. The lie endured because the performances were perfect.
History remembers the crowns, but it often forgets the stage hands, the hands that dressed the stage, the voices that filled it, the bodies that paid for the scene with their freedom. To understand medieval slavery is to understand that power did not merely command labor, it curated desire. It did not simply build armies, it built atmospheres. It did not only take, it taught people to give with a trembling grace and to call that giving love. That is why the stories that escape the curtains feel both intoxicating and unbearable. They show us rulers addicted to the echo of their own wishes and the enslaved perfecting an art that should never have been necessary, the art of appearing to want what one must endure. Silk and iron, perfume and punishment, each made the other shine brighter. And in that shine, the truth disappeared just long enough for a dynasty to call itself civilized. The allure of power is the oldest seduction. It places a crown on the head and a mask on the mirror. It teaches the hand to take and the heart to rename taking as tenderness. And when the performance is complete, when the room is quiet, the candles are out, and only the faint sweetness of incense remains, both the master and the captive have been changed. One no longer remembers how to live without obedience. The other no longer remembers how to be seen without a costume. This is the palace's most carefully guarded secret. Not that the enslaved were used, but that the rulers were remade, softened in their selfishness, sharpened in their appetites, addicted to the very theater they directed. The show could not end because the show had become the world.
The grandeur of medieval courts was not only measured in gold or armies, it was measured in rituals, some public, many secret, and a few so disturbing that historians only wrote of them in whispers. To step into a royal court was to enter a theater where every movement had meaning, every word had weight, and every silence concealed something darker. The market before the court. Before slaves reached these palaces of marble and silk, they passed through markets. Not ordinary markets of fruit or fabric, but markets of flesh. Rows of men and women stood under the gaze of buyers, their worth discussed in the language of merchants, their beauty measured like jewels, their strength tested like cattle. For the rulers who sent their agents to these markets, this was the first ritual: selection. It was not random. A voice was tested to see if it could sing. A walk was judged to see if it carried grace. Skin was examined not only for health, but for allure. The process was both clinical and sensual, stripping humanity into categories of usefulness and charm. The chosen were then polished like artifacts: perfumes, oils, silks, even lessons in posture and language, all tools to transform a person into a presentation. By the time they entered the court, they were not merely slaves, they were performances, prepared to enchant, ready to obey. Rituals of presentation. In the great halls, presentation itself became ritual. Imagine a ceremony where new slaves were paraded before nobles, expected to bow, smile, and perform small gestures of elegance. The audience, kings, queens, generals, would watch with eyes that were cold and hungry. Approval could bring luxury, disapproval could bring ruin. Some courts demanded that slaves perform in dances, their movements choreographed to display obedience and grace. Others forced them to recite poetry or play instruments, their talents turned into proof that they were not only bodies, but also entertainment. The humiliation was in the duality: to be admired and owned at the same time, to be desired and yet utterly powerless.
Hidden chambers, hidden rules. But beyond the public ceremonies lay the hidden rituals, the ones no scribe dared to write openly. Inside chambers shielded by curtains, rules governed encounters between rulers and their slaves. A slave might be ordered to undress slowly, not for choice, but for ceremony. A queen might demand that attendants bathe her in silence, their hands trembling with both intimacy and fear. Even pleasure had protocols: candles lit in certain patterns, perfumes chosen to heighten the illusion, silks arranged to soften the cruelty of command. These rituals blurred the line between luxury and captivity. They made slavery appear elegant, even sacred, when in truth it was nothing but control wrapped in velvet. The watchers in the shadows. No ritual was private. Behind every locked door there were watchers. Eunuchs guarding chambers, scribes keeping quiet records, servants pretending to see nothing but absorbing everything. These invisible witnesses gave structure to the system. They ensured that the rituals continued, that obedience remained unbroken, that silence was maintained. And yet even silence could not erase the whispers. Stories leaked, rumors of rulers who became addicted to their slaves, queens who punished rivals with cruelty, slaves who rose to power through seduction. These whispers traveled through the markets, the streets, the bazaars, reshaping how empires were remembered. A theater of masks. In truth, the courts were theaters of masks. A king might smile in public while trembling in private desire. A queen might hold her crown with dignity while seething with jealousy. Slaves became mirrors for these emotions, forced to absorb them, reflect them, embody them. For the rulers, this theater was intoxicating. For the slaves, it was survival. For history, it was a secret drama, one so entangled in desire and cruelty that even centuries later it feels both seductive and unbearable. Because behind the elegance of rituals, behind the beauty of silks, lay chains, invisible but unbreakable. And the darkest ritual of all was this: to make captivity look like ceremony, to make obedience look like devotion, to make suffering look like love.
For centuries, the palaces stood like fortresses of control. From outside, they looked unshakable. Guarded gates, armies at command, rituals unbroken. Inside, the rulers lived in their theater of silk and chains, convinced the show would last forever. But illusions always crack. And when they did, they broke with whispers more dangerous than swords. Forbidden attachments. Every ruler thought he could control desire. He believed slaves were possessions, ornaments, bodies without choices. But desire is unruly. It slips through chains. It blooms in shadows. And sometimes it turns slaves from silent performers into dangerous figures of obsession. There are chronicles of kings who fell hopelessly in love with their slaves. At first, they called it control. She obeys me. She belongs to me. But slowly, the truth revealed itself. The king could not sleep without her presence. He could not make decisions without her counsel. She had become his habit, his addiction. The courtiers saw it, and they whispered. Nobles who had fought wars now feared a woman who had entered the palace as property. Queens, once untouchable, found themselves eclipsed by the glow of someone meant to remain invisible. The balance of power tilted, not because of armies, but because of desire.
Jealous queens, dangerous rivals. No palace tolerated rivals quietly. Queens and consorts did not forgive easily. Behind their jeweled crowns burned fury, and they had weapons far sharper than steel. Exile, poison, disgrace. Some slaves who rose too high met sudden ends. Cups of wine that made them tremble, silks that became their shrouds. Others were quietly sold, sent to distant lands, their names erased as if they had never existed. The cruelest punishment was erasure, to live but to be forgotten, as if their beauty and influence had been a dream. And yet, a few survived. A few mastered the game so well that even queens bowed to their influence. They whispered in the ruler's ear at night and saw their words turn into policies by day. They became shadows that shaped empires. But the higher they climbed, the sharper the knives around them. Betrayals and rebellions. Not all slaves accepted their roles. Some turned desire into a weapon. They learned the secrets of their masters, secrets of state, of alliances, of weaknesses. A whispered truth at the right moment could shake a kingdom. A lover's confession spoken in the dark could become the dagger that killed a dynasty. There are stories of empires where rebellions were sparked not by generals, but by whispers carried from chambers, of rulers betrayed not by enemies on the battlefield, but by the very slaves who had once smiled at their side. Because when power makes itself vulnerable to desire, it digs its own grave.
The illusion shatters. The grand illusion of slavery was that it could be controlled forever, that beauty, obedience, and silence would never rebel, that rituals and chains would be enough. But no illusion lasts. Behind every mask is a face. Behind every performance is a beating heart. And no amount of perfume, silk, or command could erase the humanity of the enslaved. When the illusion collapsed, it was sudden and merciless. Empires fell not only to invaders, but to their own secrets. Courtiers who once bowed in the hall whispered of scandals in the chambers. Subjects who once admired their rulers began to despise them when the hidden truths surfaced. What had been painted as luxury was revealed as corruption. What had been called elegance was unmasked as cruelty. The empire in ruins. When we look back at the ruins of palaces, the broken stones, the empty courts, the faded murals, we often forget the silks, the perfumes, the whispered rituals. But these, too, are part of the collapse. Because what destroys an empire is not only war. Sometimes it is desire left unchecked. Sometimes it is cruelty dressed as elegance. Sometimes it is the dangerous illusion that humans can be owned, turned into ornaments, and used as shadows of power. And when that illusion shatters, the ruins that remain are not only of stone and crown, but of the souls that were consumed in silence.
The Chronicles of Kings tell us about wars won, crowns forged, cities built. They glorify banners flying on battlefields, treaties signed in candlelight, dynasties stretching across centuries. But behind every crown, there were whispers. Behind every victory, there were shadows. Behind every palace wall, there were slaves whose stories were never meant to be told. Think of the irony. The rulers who believed themselves immortal, who thought their power unshakable, depended on fragile illusions woven from silk, perfume, and silence. They told themselves that obedience was devotion, that desire was loyalty, that chains could be disguised as love. But the truth cannot be buried forever. Time strips away the veils, stones crumble, gold fades, but whispers remain. The palaces have fallen, the dynasties are gone, and yet the echoes of those chambers still linger, the laughter rehearsed, the tears hidden, the rituals that blurred the line between luxury and captivity.
What does this tell us today? That power always seeks to disguise itself, that cruelty is often dressed in beauty, that control can masquerade as love, and that behind the grandest illusions of history are human beings, fragile, broken, resilient, unforgettable. The slaves of medieval empires were not just nameless shadows. They were forced performers in the theater of power. They endured chains covered with silk, punishments hidden behind curtains, and desires that claimed to be love. Their lives remind us of the dangerous seduction of unchecked power, a seduction that destroyed not only them, but the empires that believed they could own them. So the next time history presents you with a tale of glory, of kings, of queens, of empires, remember the hidden side. Remember the secrets buried in time. Because history is not only what shines in marble and gold, history is also what trembles in shadows, what bleeds in silence, what whispers from behind locked doors. And perhaps the greatest secret of all is this, that power is never as strong as it looks, and freedom is never as silent as it seems.
If you found yourself drawn into these forbidden truths, then join me as we uncover more of history's hidden shadows. Subscribe to Secrets Buried in Time, and together we will keep lifting the veils that empires tried to keep shut forever.